Passionate Reply, and welcome to Great Albums. So far in this series, we've looked at a lot of older albums, and that's by design. While I listen to and love plenty of more recent music and younger artists, I've decided to focus great albums on works that are at least 10 years old. That's partly because I think that having some distance from when albums were released lets us situate them in fuller context and take their legacy into consideration. It's also partly because so much of the music criticism that's out there is focused, somewhat myopically, on only the newest and hottest releases, when there's so much amazing music to be discovered outside of that purview. Now that that's out of the way, let's get on to discussing today's album. John Mouse's We Must Become the Pitiless Censors of Ourselves, which was released in 2011, 1 decade prior to this video. It's an album that was very significant to me as a teenager when it was new, and one that I think will go on to be seen as one of the most important electronic albums of this decade. Before releasing his arguable magnum opus, John Mouse had 2 LPs under his belt, Songs and Love Is Real. They earned him some cult followers, but also attracted substantial derision and disdain. While many elements of Mouse's signature sound are present, such as lo-fi production, atmospheric washes of synth, and lyrics that straddle the line between pithy and biting, I'd characterize these releases as being very, rough around the edges. Too Much Money off of Love Is Real is tantalizingly close to a pop song, but its truly shocking bridge seems almost deliberately crafted to shatter our ability to enjoy it as such. Mouse had initially set out to be an experimental, outsider musician, but he soon became more interested in the tradition of pop, particularly after meeting his longtime friend and artistic collaborator Ariel Pink. It was in that pop spirit that Mouse created We Must Become the Pitiless Censors of Ourselves, and the resultant increase in accessibility is what made his third album so different, and so much more successful. There's a certain charm that only comes from an outsider attempting to do pop, a fusion of intuitive mass appeal and an intuitive, unschooled process of creation. This album has that in abundance. While Hey Moon is one of Mouse's best-known tracks, it's actually a cover, and was originally penned by singer-songwriter Molly Nilsson. It's a very simple and very pop composition, and it's easy to see how it embodies the sort of straightforward songwriting Mouse had in the back of his mind while creating the album. But it fundamentally lacks the signature oddness of Mouse, and I think that leaves it as the least interesting track here. With everything else going on, Hey Moon feels all the more plain and banal in comparison. Listening to And the Rain, it's easy to hear how strongly Mouse was also influenced by classical and medieval composers. Besides those organ-like synth textures, Mouse is also inspired by the medieval modes and pre-tonal ideas about melody. Whenever contemporary music uses slightly older synthesizer technology and/or that lo-fi production, many people become preoccupied with using ideas of 80s nostalgia and retro chic to understand it. I think this album has less to do with old school cool and more to do with the specter of the past as something faded and ineffable, accessible only through the dim consolations of memory. Consider Quantum Leap, which presents us with a hazy dream of time travel, contrasted with the dead zone of the present. Leap's more strident moments, I like to think that a whiff of the in-your-face abrasiveness of Too Much Money remains. But rather than scornful and vitriolic, it comes across as the overwhelming splendor of divine mystery, thanks to its appropriation of medieval church music. There are many antecedents of what Mouse is doing with it, from the tradition of goth to the work of other electronic musicians like John Foxx, but what Mouse really excels at is weaving together the sacred and the profane, and getting us to forget which is supposed to be which. For a more splendid example of that, look no further than Matter of Fact. Yes, you heard that correctly. This song's only lyrics are, "Pussy is not a matter of fact." I'm tempted to compare this laconic number to some of Mouse's earlier pieces that seem to satirize easily spouted slogans of social change, such as rights for gays. The core assertion here could be interpreted as a rebuttal of essentialism with regards to gender and sex, or perhaps of toxic masculinity and the idea of a man feeling entitled to a woman's body and sexuality. But its ambiguity and possible meaninglessness are, I think, part of what makes it so effective. Still, as far as transgressive lyricism goes, the use of the term pussy here pales in comparison to the preceding track, Cop Killer. described himself as extremely left-wing, but he's also consistently maintained that his music isn't meant to be interpreted through a strictly political lens. But however much Mouse insists that Cop Killer is really about metaphorical cops, its seemingly blatant call for violence feels obscene. 10 years ago, Cop Killer was shock art and an expression of the unsayable. But in the past year, more and more people have opened up to criticism of police brutality and police as an institution. Cop Killer has been reevaluated and recontextualized, and interest in the track has surged. It's had a degree of vindication that most provocative and challenging art will never see, no matter how powerful. Given Mouse's frequent emphasis on ideas of criminality, justice, and the punitive arm of the government, I'm tempted to interpret the lighthouse featured on the cover of We Must Become the Pitiless Censors of Ourselves as a reference to the Panopticon prisons designed by the Enlightenment thinker Jeremy Bentham. Bentham proposed prisons and other state buildings in which a single observation tower stood watch over people to be controlled. Prisoners cannot tell when and if they are being observed, and thus are forced to live as though they are under constant surveillance and internalize the structures of social control. The Panopticon has often been used as a symbol of how structures of discipline and punishment affect the psyche of those who live within them, most famously by the 20th century philosopher Michel Foucault. But this is, of course, me using political theory to try and pin Mouse down. We can also set this aside and appreciate the cover design for its aesthetic ambiance. Its fog and tumultuous sea evoke the wild or unrefined qualities of the music, but the bright and piercing light of the lighthouse suggests a firm and directed focus, not unlike Mouse's stated goal of creating bona fide pop. The album's ponderous title doesn't actually appear on the associated artwork. This isn't so uncommon nowadays, but when physical media was more central to music consumption, it was a self-sabotaging move that few but New Order ever got away with. Mouse was one of the first artists I became aware of who chose to omit text from album art, and it struck me as a very bold and forward-thinking adaptation to an increasingly digital world. Mouse nicked the title, We Must Become the Pitiless Censors of Ourselves, from the work of the philosopher Alain Badiou, under whom he studied at university. Like that piercing ray of light, it seems to suggest a pruning away of impurities and a recalibration or refocusing of one's energies. It applies equally well to the idea of becoming sanctified or purified in the presence of the holy, or, more prosaically, to Mouse's newly pop-oriented artistic direction. After the success of We Must Become the Pitiless Censors of Ourselves, Mouse's follow-up was essentially the 2012 compilation, a collection of rarities and previously unreleased material, which featured assorted tracks he had written throughout the preceding decade. Over the next few years, Mouse chose to isolate himself from the public eye, claiming to not see himself continuing a career in music and instead pursuing a PhD in political science. He eventually returned, however, and released a fourth LP in 2017, entitled Screen Memories. Screen Memories would continue the focus on hooky and accessible melodies, while also increasing the use of guitar and bass to bring Mouse's sound a bit closer to rock. While Mouse hasn't put down any new material since Screen Memories, he has made himself substantially more notorious quite recently, by having been present at the attempted coup at the United States Capitol building in January of 2021. Given Mouse's aforementioned radical leftism and his cryptic but seemingly anti-fascist oriented tweets afterward, it seems unlikely that Mouse actually supported the insurrection, but the incident continues to cast a shadow over his reputation, at least for the time being. Whether Mouse is ever truly rehabilitated or not, and wherever his true intentions and sympathies lay, his music has certainly left an indelible mark. We Must Become the Pitiless Censors of Ourselves was a watershed moment for this idea of lo-fi electronic pop with a gothic and mysterious aura to it, and I don't think the sound would be so commonplace in today's musical landscape without what John Naus had accomplished 10 years before. My favorite track on We Must Become the Pitiless Censors of Ourselves is Head for the Country. Its stirring and anthemic refrain is one of the most emotionally powerful moments on the album, particularly when juxtaposed with its lyrical themes of feeling confined by society's rules and its return to the idea of criminality or deviance. It's probably too intense and overbearing to ever pass for an ordinary pop hit. But who's keeping score? That's everything for today. Thanks for listening.